Most people look at 400 acres of Kentucky timber and see a view. My son-in-law, Brett, looked at it and saw a paycheck. He saw an old man who was past his prime and a farm that was underperforming. What he didn't see, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that for 30 years, my job for the federal government was to find the things people tried to hide underground. Brett thought he was burying me. He didn't realize he was digging his own grave in a federally protected mineral reserve. And by the time the first shovel hit the dirt, I'd already ensured he'd never own so much as a grain of sand on this property again. Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. I was sitting on the porch when the rental SUV turned onto the gravel drive. It was a silver Range Rover, the kind of car that looks like it's trying too hard to be rugged while fearing a single speck of dust. It didn't belong in the Kentucky backcountry, and it certainly didn't belong on a farm that had been in my family for 4 generations. I didn't stop what I was doing. I had my father's old pocket knife in my hand, a case trapper with a bone handle worn smooth by 50 years of work. I was cleaning the blade with a rag soaked in a little bit of 3-in-1 oil. The smell of the oil is sharp, clean, and honest. It's a scent that reminds me of things that last. You know that sound gravel makes when a heavy car rolls over it? It's a crunch, a protest of the earth under the weight of something that doesn't live there. I listened to it. I timed my breaths to it. I knew why he was here. A man like Brett doesn't drive 2 hours from the city on a Tuesday just to check on his father-in-law's health. He drives that distance when he smells a deal. My grandson, Leo, was about 30 yards away, near the edge of the creek. He's 6 years old, and he was wearing a pair of oversized rubber boots that reached his knees. He had a small yellow plastic shovel and a bucket. He was looking for treasure, which in his world meant smooth river stones or the occasional fossilized bit of crinoid stem. He looked up when the SUV crunched to a halt, then looked at me. I gave him a small nod, the kind of silent communication men share when they understand the world. He went back to his digging. Brett stepped out of the car. He was wearing a quilted vest over a crisp button-down shirt and loafers that cost more than my first tractor. He looked at the mud on the driveway with a faint expression of disgust, like he was stepping into a crime scene. He didn't see the rich, loamy soil that had sustained my family through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. He just saw something that would ruin his floor mats. "Miller," he said, offering a tight, practiced smile, "you're looking, well, hardy." "Brett," I replied. I didn't get up. I just kept wiping the blade. I didn't get up. I just kept wiping the blade. I just kept wiping the blade. I just kept wiping the blade. "You're a long way from the city on a Tuesday." "Business doesn't sleep, even in the rolling hills," he said. He walked up the porch steps, his loafers clicking on the wood. He didn't look at the view, the 400 acres of timber and pasture that stretched out towards the horizon. He looked at the paint peeling on the railing. I saw his eyes linger on it, mentally calculating the cost of a renovation, or more likely, a demolition. He sat down in the wicker chair next to mine. He smelled of expensive cologne, something citrusy and aggressive that had no business competing with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy brochure. He laid it on the small table between us, right next to my tin of oil. It was a heavy, high-gloss paper, expensive. "I've been doing some thinking, Miller," he started. He leaned in, lowering his voice the way men do when they're about to tell you a lie for your own good. "About the legacy, about Leo's future. This farm, it's a lot of work. It's a burden on a man your age, and let's be honest, the market for artisanal cattle isn't what it used to be." I looked at the brochure. The title read, "Bluegrass Horizons, Luxury Living in the Heart of the Commonwealth." There were 3D renderings of modern white houses with black trim, a clubhouse with a shimmering pool and a gated entrance. It looked like every other soul-crushing subdivision in America. Land optimization, Brett said. He loved that phrase. He said it twice more, letting it hang in the air like he'd just discovered fire. We could turn this place into something world-class. You'd have a suite in the main house, no more chores, and a trust fund for Leo that would make him a king by the time he's 18. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just closed the knife. The click of the blade locking into the handle was the only sound on the porch. I looked at the dirt under my nick fingers, dirt that had been turned by my grandfather, my father, and me. I wanted him to feel the silence. Most people get nervous when a man doesn't speak. They start filling the holes with more words, and that's when they reveal their hand. "The land isn't a burden, Miller," I said quietly. "It's the floor. It's the only thing that doesn't move when the world gets shaky. My father always told me they can print more money, but they stopped making dirt a long time ago. It's an asset, Miller, and right now it's an underperforming one." He patted the brochure. "Just look it over. I've already had some preliminary conversations with the county. There's a lot of excitement about bringing this kind of tax base to the area. They're talking about rezoning the whole corridor." I looked at him then, really looked at him. I saw the desperation behind the confidence. I saw the way his eyes darted at the old barn, not with respect for the history it held, but as a hurdle to be cleared. He thought he was playing chess with a man who didn't know the rules. I knew the rules. I knew the loopholes, and I knew exactly what was sitting 300 feet beneath his expensive loafers. He stayed for an hour. He talked about synergy and equity. He never once asked about the harvest or the health of the timber. When he finally left, the silver SUV kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on my hydrangeas, I picked up the brochure. I didn't throw it away. I took it inside and put it on the kitchen table, right next to the bowl where I keep the keys to the tractor. I watched him from the window as he stopped his car at the end of the driveway. He took a picture of the creek, Leo's Creek. He wasn't taking a picture of the scenery. He was taking a picture of an obstacle. I felt a quiet dread in the pit of my stomach, the kind you get when you see the clouds turning a certain shade of green before a storm. I went into the kitchen and made coffee. I used the old percolator. The sound of it, the rhythmic thump, hiss, is a patient sound. It reminded me that the best things take time. I looked at the brochure again, then at the dirt under my nick fingers. The game had started. I closed the kitchen curtains. I made coffee. I waited. The campaign of concern started 3 days later. It wasn't a frontal assault. Brett was too slick for that. It was a series of small, pointed jabs designed to make me feel like the world was slipping through my fingers. He wanted me to doubt my own senses, my own history, and eventually my own sovereignty over this land. He started showing up unannounced with friends. One Friday morning, while the dew was still heavy on the clover, he arrived with a man named Gary. Gary wore a hard hat that looked like it had never seen a day of actual work and carried a digital clipboard. Brett introduced him as a specialist in residential safety. They spent 2 hours walking around the farmhouse, Gary tisk-tisking at the foundation and pointing at hairline cracks in the plaster that had been there since the Nixon administration. I followed them, my boots echoing on the hardwood Mary and I had polished for 30 years. I didn't say much. I just watched. "I'm worried about you in here, Miller," Brett said, his voice dripping with a manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. "If there's a heavy freeze this winter, these pipes are going to go, and this foundation, Gary says it's a liability. What if you're here alone and the floor gives way? We'd never forgive ourselves." "The floor hasn't moved in 100 years, Brett," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's white oak. It'll be here long after Gary's clipboard runs out of battery." Brett chuckled, that bless his heart chuckle people use when they think they're talking to someone who's losing their grip. "That's the thing, Miller. You're so used to the decay you don't even see it anymore. It's like that conversation we had last month, the one about the back 40. You told me you were ready to let it go, and now you're acting like we never spoke." I looked at him. I had never said any such thing. I have a memory like a steel trap. You don't spend 30 days cataloging federal land claims without learning how to archive a conversation in your head. But Brett just smiled, shaking his head with a look of feigned pity. I'm concerned, Miller, truly. You're forgetting things, important things. Maybe it's the stress of the farm. It's a lot for one man. Maybe you left the stove on again. I thought I smelled gas when I walked in. There was no gas. There was no back 40 conversation. It was a psychological siege. He wanted to paint a picture of a man who was a danger to himself, a man who needed a conservator to handle his affairs. I didn't argue. I've learned that when a man is trying to sell you a lie, the best thing you can do is let him talk. He'll eventually provide the rope. Instead, I started carrying a small leather ledger in my pocket. Every time Brett spoke, every time he made a claim about my forgetfulness or the dilapidated state of the property, I waited until he left and then I wrote it down. Date, time, GPS coordinates of where we stood, verbatim. He began sending me informational emails, which he'd print out and leave on my counter, about assisted living facilities. He called them resort-style senior communities. He told my daughter, Sarah's namesake, that I was struggling to keep up with the basics. He told the farm was hemorrhaging money and that I was clinging to a sinking ship out of pride. One afternoon, I watched him from the porch. He was at the edge of the property line, near the old stone wall my great-grandfather built. He had a laser level and a digital camera. He thought I was watching the sunset, lost in a daze of old age. I wasn't. I was watching him trespass on a legacy he hadn't earned. He was slicker than a wet road, but he forgot one thing. I wasn't born yesterday. I knew exactly what those survey pins meant, and I knew that once you start moving markers, you're not just a son-in-law anymore, you're a liability. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. That night, after the house went quiet, and the only sound was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the long case clock in the hall, I went into the sewing room. I don't go in there often. It's a small room on the second floor, the one with the best view of the north pasture, and it still smells like her. A faint lingering scent of lavender sachets and the sharp, clean smell of the starch she used on the linens. I sat down in her old wooden chair. It creaked in a way that felt like a greeting. I ran my hand over the worn wood of her quilting frame. My wife, Mary, had a way of seeing the beauty in things that were rugged. She was the one who insisted we keep the old oak tree near the porch, even when a lightning strike almost split it in two back in '94. She said the scars made it stronger. She said a tree that survives a fire knows something about the earth that a pampered sapling never will. We spent 30 years paying for this dirt. I remember the year the drought hit in the late '80s, the big dry. We almost lost the lower pasture. I remember Mary sitting at the kitchen table with a blue ink ledger, her brow furrowed under the yellow light of the overhead lamp, finding ways to stretch a single dollar until it groaned. She didn't buy a new dress for 5 years so we could clear the north timber and build the barn. We built this together, acre by acre, fence post by fence post. I closed my eyes, and I could almost hear her humming that old hymn she loved, "Great is thy faithfulness." She used to hum it while she worked the garden, her hands deep in the soil, pulling weeds with a determination that most men would envy. She didn't work that soil for 30 years just so a man in a silk tie could pave it over with asphalt and call it bluegrass horizons. Brett saw the land as a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. He saw underperforming assets. He didn't know about the blood in the soil. He didn't know about the night the barn caught fire and the neighbors stayed until dawn to help us save the livestock, their faces black with soot and their lungs burning. He didn't know that this land was the only thing I had left that still felt like her. I reached into the small drawer of her sewing table and pulled out a single recipe card. On the back, in her neat looping handwriting, she had written a verse, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof." Underneath it, she'd added her own postscript, "But the taxes are ours, Miller. Keep the receipts and keep the faith." She was always the practical one. She knew that legacy isn't something you talk about, it's something you defend. I tucked that recipe card into my leather ledger, right next to the notes on Brett's lies. The grief was there, a heavy, cold weight in my chest, but it was being slowly replaced by something different, something surgical. Brett thought I was just a grieving old man waiting for the end, staring out at a sunset I couldn't understand. He didn't realize I was a man with a very specific set of tools, and I was finally ready to open the toolbox. He wanted to play with the dirt? Fine. I was going to show him exactly what was buried in it. She didn't leave me this farm to lose it to a man who thinks heritage is a marketing slogan. She left it to me to guard. She smiled at me once, 30 years ago, when we finally signed the deed to the last 40 acres. I can still see the way the light hit her eyes. I smiled then, and I smiled now in the dark of the sewing room. I got up, closed the door quietly, and headed for the basement. I went down to my basement office. It's a room most people in the family forget exists, tucked behind the furnace room and lined with steel filing cabinets that moved with me since my days in D.C. It's cool down there, smelling of old paper and the damp limestone foundation. This was my sanctuary, where I kept the records of a 30-year career with the Department of the Interior. I was a senior mineral rights assessor, a job that most people don't understand, and even fewer respect, until they realize it's the only thing standing between them and a corporate takeover. I sat at my desk and pulled out my old federal ID. The photo is 20 years old, my hair more salt than pepper back then, but the eyes are the same. They look for the truth beneath the surface. I turned on my computer and accessed the public records for the county. I didn't need a password. The public portal is enough if you know which specific subdirectories to look for. I started with the title search. I wanted to see exactly what Brett had been filing while I was forgetting our conversations. What I found made my blood run cold, but my hands stayed steady. Brett had formed an LLC called Bluegrass Horizons. About 2 months ago, he had filed an intent to develop with the County Planning Commission. Attached to the filing was a document that shouldn't have existed, a Grant of Development Authority. I clicked the PDF and zoomed in. There it was, my signature. It was a masterpiece of forgery. It had the slight tremor I've developed in my right hand, the way the M in Miller loops back on itself, and the way the R at the end of Vance trails off. But I knew I hadn't signed it. I checked the date on the document, March 14th. That was the day I was in the city for my heart checkup. Brett had offered to watch the house. He hadn't been watching the house. He'd been raiding my desk for a signature sample. Then I dug into his personal finances, using my old professional networks, calls to people who still owe me favors at the FDIC and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. I found the weight of his gamble. Brett hadn't just lied, he had bet his life on my silence. He had taken out a high-interest bridge loan for $4 million against the expected value of the development. He'd used that forged development authority as his primary collateral. He was over-leveraged, desperate, and moving at a speed that screamed impending collapse. He was a Type 1 overreacher. He thought the finish line was closer than it was, so he'd stopped checking his footing. I pulled up the geological surveys for my specific coordinates, surveys I had helped map back in the 90s. Most people, when they buy land, think they own everything from the sky to the center of the earth. In Kentucky, that's rarely true. We operate under split estate law. You can own the surface, the grass and the trees, but someone else can own the minerals underneath. And I knew exactly what was under my property.
running right through the center of the property, exactly where Brett's glossy brochure placed the grand clubhouse and the main sewer line, was a vein of high-grade Kentucky coal. But it wasn't just coal. It was part of a federally protected subsurface reserve established during the energy crisis. More importantly, there was a dormant environmental easement attached to the mineral rights to protect the watershed of the creek where Leo played. I checked the survey coordinates one last time. According to the federal maps, the center of my property was legally unbuildable for any commercial structure larger than a shed. The Bluegrass Horizons plan wasn't just ambitious, it was a ghost. It was a multi-million-dollar house of cards built on a foundation of forged signatures and geological ignorance. I printed the documents, the maps, the easement records, and the evidence of the forgery. I filed them in a crisp blue folder. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt cold, surgical. I went back upstairs. I checked the kitchen drawer. The brochure was still there. I looked at the date on the groundbreaking ceremony invitation Brett had tucked inside. He had 3 days left before he invited the world to watch him fail. He did not know that. I closed the folder. I made coffee. I waited.
The next afternoon, I was sitting on the porch when Leo came running up from the creek. He wasn't carrying his yellow shovel, and his bucket was lying abandoned in the tall grass. He was crying, not the loud, attention-seeking cry of a child who skinned a knee, but the quiet, shaking sob of a boy who had just had his world tilted on its axis. "Grandpa," he wheezed, climbing into my lap. His small hands were stained of the gray clay of the creek bed. "Daddy says we have to go. He says the creek is going to be a big pool, and I can't dig for treasure anymore. He said the tractor is going to eat the trees." I held him, feeling the small, sharp bones of his shoulders through his t-shirt. I felt a slow, dark heat rise in my chest. It's one thing to try and steal an old man's land. It's another thing entirely to use a child's fear as a lever. "Is that right?" I asked, my voice as steady as I could make it. "He said it's for my own good," Leo sobbed into my shirt. "He said you're going to a special hotel where they have people to take care of you. I don't want you to go to a hotel. I want to stay here with the fossils." I smoothed his hair, looking out over the pasture. I realized then that Brett wasn't just planning a development, he was planning a liquidation. He was clearing the board. I went inside and called my daughter, Brett's wife. I kept my voice level. I asked her about the college fund we had set up for Leo, a fund Mary and I had seeded with $100,000 shortly after he was born. It was meant to be untouched, a bedrock for his future. There was a long, painful silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, jagged and thin. "Dad," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance, "Brett said he had to reallocate those funds for a short-term investment. He said it was the only way to ensure Leo's long-term future. He told me you'd signed off on it because of the tax implications." "I see," I said. My grip tightened on the phone until my knuckles turned white. "And did he mention a bridge loan or a company called Bluegrass Horizons?" "A what? No. He just said it was a secure portfolio move. Dad, is something wrong? He's been so stressed lately, saying the farm is a financial drain on you." "Don't worry about the money, honey," I said, cutting her off gently. "I'm going to handle it. You just keep Leo's mind off the move. There isn't going to be one." I hung up. The picture was complete now. Brett hadn't just targeted my estate, he had robbed his own child's future to pay the vig on his $4 million gamble. He used my name to lie to my daughter and used my senility to justify the theft. He was willing to bankrupt the next generation to fuel his own vanity and keep that silver Range Rover in the driveway.
I went back out to the porch. Leo was sitting on the top step, looking at the empty creek path. "Leo," I said, "you remember what we talked about? About the real treasure?" He nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "The real treasure isn't the stones, son. It's the dirt. And as long as I'm breathing, nobody is filling in that creek. You hear me? No tractors are eating those trees." He looked at me, and for the first time in a week, the fear left his eyes. He saw the version of me that the federal government used to send into boardrooms to say no. I went to the barn and got my old transit, my survey-in chains, and several rolls of high-visibility orange marking tape. If Brett wanted a groundbreaking, I was going to give him one he'd never forget. He took the boys' college money. Now, I'm taking everything else. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real.
The trap I built was 4 layers deep. It was a masterpiece of regulatory gridlock, designed to be invisible until the moment it snapped shut. In my line of work, we call this a sovereign freeze. Most people think you need a courtroom to stop a man like Brett. You don't. You just need to know which gears in the machinery of the state to jam. Layer 1 was the correction of record. I drove down to the county clerk's office, a small brick building where the air always smells like old toner and floor wax. I've known the staff there for 40 years. I sat down with Sarah, the head clerk, and showed her the Grant of Development Authority with my forged signature. I didn't make a scene, I didn't shout, I just filed a formal affidavit of forgery and a notice of non-consent. "Miller, this is serious," Sarah whispered, looking at the 2 signatures side by side. "It is," I said. "But do me a favor, Sarah. File it, timestamp it, but don't push it to the digital portal for 48 hours. I want the paper trail locked, but I don't want the alarm bells ringing quite yet." Layer 2 was the subsurface resource review. I called in a favor with a former colleague at the Department of the Interior, a man named Silas, who still remembers when I saved his career back in '98. I reported potential unauthorized surface disturbance over a protected federal mineral reserve. This triggered an automatic federal freeze under the Federal Land and Policy Management Act. You see, when there's a protected mineral vein involved, federal jurisdiction supersedes local zoning. Brett's bluegrass horizons just hit a wall of federal red tape that would take a decade to clear. He was planning to break ground in 3 days. The federal government was about to tell him he couldn't even dig a trench for a garden hose. Layer 3 was the bait. I knew Brett was monitoring my movements and my mail. He'd been checking my kitchen counter every time he stopped by. So I prepared a fake appraisal, a glowing document on official-looking letterhead that suggested the farm was worth twice what his bridge loan was for, provided the development broke ground by the end of the month. I left it out in the open, tucked under a bowl of apples. I watched him through the kitchen window as he snapped a photo of it with his phone, his eyes widening with greed. He thought he'd found the jackpot. Instead, he went straight to his lenders and doubled down, borrowing another $500,000 to pay for a lavish groundbreaking ceremony to impress his investors. He was sprinting toward a cliff, and I'd just greased the edge. Layer 4 was the notice of reversion. This was the kill shot. I dug into the original 1920 deed for the property, a document written on vellum that felt like dried skin. My great-grandfather was a man who didn't trust easily. He had included a covenant of agricultural use. If the land was ever diverted for non-farm use without the unanimous consent of all living heirs, the title would automatically revert to a trust controlled by the state's agricultural university. Brett wasn't an heir. He was a son-in-law who thought he'd bullied his way into ownership. My daughter was the heir, and she hadn't signed a single legal document regarding the development. I spent the final evening sitting on the porch watching the fireflies dance over the pasture. I felt a strange sense of peace. Brett was in the city, probably ordering champagne and measuring for curtains in a clubhouse that would never exist. I was sitting on the truth. The technicality of split estate law is a beautiful thing. It means that while you might own the grass, I own the bones of the earth, and the bones always have the final say. Brett was measuring for a trophy. I was measuring for a coffin. The day of the groundbreaking was a Tuesday, the air heavy with the scent of mown grass and the ozone of a coming storm. Brett had gone all out. He'd hired a high-end catering company from the city that set up a white silk tent in the middle of my north pasture. There were circular tables with linen cloths, a bar serving small-batch bourbon, and a row of 10 shiny gold-painted shovels lined up in a custom-built mahogany rack. There were about 30 people there. 3 major investors, men in sharp charcoal suits who looked like they'd never stepped in cow manure in their lives, and a representative from the regional bank named Henderson who held the keys to Brett's bridge loan. Even a local news reporter was there, clutching a microphone and looking for a feel-good story about rural revitalization. I waited in the farmhouse until I heard the PA system crackle to life. I didn't wear my overalls. I put on my old charcoal suit, the one I used to wear when I had to testify before Senate subcommittee hearings. I pinned my retired federal service pin to the lapel. I looked in the mirror, adjusted my tie, and picked up the blue folder. I walked out onto the porch just as Brett was taking the stage, a small wooden riser decorated with Bluegrass Horizons banners. He looked like a man who had already won. His chest was puffed out, his quilted vest replaced by a tailored blazer. "This is about more than just homes," Brett's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the barn where I'd spent 40 years of my life. "This is about the future. It's about taking a legacy that has stagnated, a beautiful piece of land that has been sitting idle, and turning it into something world-class. I want to thank my father-in-law, Miller, for his cooperation in finally stepping aside to let the next generation lead us into the 21st century." He looked toward the porch and winked. A few people clapped. The bank representative, Henderson, smiled and nodded. I didn't smile back. I started walking. The crowd parted as I approached the riser. I didn't look like a confused old man anymore. I walked with the measured, heavy gait of a man who knows exactly where the landmines are buried because he's the one who mapped them. "Brett," I said. I didn't shout, but I spent my life learning how to project my voice in drafty hearing rooms. The PA system caught my tone, and the chatter in the tent died instantly. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding regarding the cooperation you just mentioned." Brett's smile flickered, then hardened into a mask of forced patience. "Miller, now isn't the time. We're in the middle of a ceremony. Why don't you go grab a bourbon and we'll talk about the plumbing later?" "We aren't talking about plumbing, Brett," I said, stepping onto the grass right in front of the gold shovels. I reached into my coat and pulled out the blue folder. "We're talking about Title 43 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and we're talking about a little thing called a split estate." The bank representative, Henderson, squinted at me, his professional instincts clearly kicking in. "Excuse me, who exactly are you?" "My name is Miller Vance. I'm a retired senior mineral rights assessor for the federal government, and I am the sole owner of the subsurface mineral estate for this 400-acre tract, which means, Mr. Henderson, that your client here just tried to sell you the icing on a cake he doesn't have the right to bake." A murmur rippled through the investors. Brett's face went from tanned to a sickly mottled gray. That's nonsense," Brett shouted, his voice cracking. He stepped off the riser, moving toward me. "I have the grant of development authority. Miller signed it himself. I have the paperwork." "I did no such thing, Brett," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and heavy. I pulled out the second document. "This is a certified copy of the affidavit of forgery I filed with the county clerk. And this," I held up my phone, pressing play on a recording of him from the previous Friday, is you telling me I forgot our conversation about the back 40. It's a shame, Brett. Forgery is a Class D felony in this state, and since you used that forged document to secure a $4 million bridge loan across state lines, the FBI is going to call it wire fraud. The reporter started filming. The investors were already stepping away from Brett as if his failure was contagious. "He's lying," he screamed, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "He's an old man. He's senile. He's losing his mind and trying to take me down with him." "I'm not the one losing things, Brett," I said quietly. I looked at Henderson. "I'd suggest you check your due diligence. You'll find that the intent to develop was flagged by the Bureau of Land Management 4 hours ago. This project is legally dead. It is unbuildable, uninsurable, and currently the subject of a criminal referral." Henderson looked at the documents, then at the gold shovels, then at Brett. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping the silk of the tent. "Brett," Henderson said, his voice like ice, "did you verify the mineral rights before we closed on the bridge loan?" I used the local title search," he stammered. "The local title search only covers the surface, you idiot. You was so busy trying to move me into a resort-style home that you forgot to check what was under your own feet. You had more front than a department store window, but you didn't have a leg to stand on." The investors didn't wait for the catering. They headed for their cars without a word. The reporter was frantically asking Henderson for a comment on the alleged fraud. Brett stood there, surrounded by his gold shovels and his silk tent, looking at a $4 million debt that was now anchored to a piece of land he could never touch. He looked at me, his face twisted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You ruined it," he hissed. "You ruined everything for a bunch of dirt." "No, Brett," I said, leaning in so only he could hear me. "I saved the dirt, and I saved my grandson's future. I know about Leo's college fund, and I've already spoken to the prosecutor about where that money went. You should probably return the Range Rover on your way to the station. I don't think they have valet parking where you're going." I turned my back on him and walked toward the house. I heard him let out a ragged, desperate scream, the sound of a man realizing the trap had closed. I didn't look back. I went inside, took off my suit jacket, and went to the kitchen. The only thing he'd be developing now was a defense strategy for a federal indictment.
It's been 6 months since the groundbreaking that wasn't. The Bluegrass Horizons sign is gone. It didn't take long for the weather to claim it. The wind tore the vinyl banners to shreds, and eventually the local kids spray-painted something over the luxury living slogan. Now the only sign at the end of the driveway is a simple hand-painted board that says, "No trespassing." Brett is currently facing 3 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of second-degree forgery. His lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the federal prosecutor, a woman named Elena, who I worked with on a complex coal land case back in '05, isn't feeling particularly charitable. She's seen enough elder financial abuse to last a lifetime. The silver SUV was repossessed within 3 weeks. My daughter has filed for divorce. She's staying in the city for now, but she brings Leo out every weekend. She looks lighter somehow, like a weight she didn't know she was carrying has finally been lifted. The bridge loan company tried to sue me, of course. Their lawyers claimed I'd intentionally interfered with a business contract. My attorney, an old friend from the JAG office, pointed out that a contract based on a forged signature isn't a contract, it's a confession. They dropped the suit and settled with the trust I set up for Leo, restoring his college fund plus interest to avoid a bad faith countersuit. They were so desperate to avoid a public audit of their lending practices that they paid out in less than a month. I'm sitting on the porch again. The long case clock in the hall just struck 4. It's Sunday. I just finished winding it. The same ritual I've performed every week since Mary and I bought it at an estate sale in Lexington 30 years ago. It's a patience sound, the ticking. It tells you that time doesn't care about your land optimization or your synergy. It just keeps moving. Leo is down by the creek. He's wearing a new pair of boots, and he's found a particularly large piece of limestone with the perfect imprint of a prehistoric shell. He ran up to the porch 5 minutes ago to show me. He told me he was richer than a king. I told him he was right. I pulled out my father's case trapper knife and a fresh rag. There's a little bit of rust starting on the hinge, and I can't have that. The air is cool today, smelling of damp cedar and the coming winter. The farm is quiet. The 400 acres are exactly as they were when Mary and I first stood on this porch and looked at the future. People like Brett think they can outrun the truth. They think the world is something you can shape with enough glossy brochures and loud talk. They think that a man who's quiet is empty. But they forget that the world has a memory. The land has a memory. And if you listen closely enough to the earth beneath your feet, it'll tell you exactly where you stand. I closed the knife. The click echoed in the quiet afternoon, sharp and final. I looked at the dirt under my fingernails, the same dirt I've spent a lifetime protecting, and I smiled. The dirt is patient. I suppose I am too.